from Signa Group. Just going over some house rules quickly before we run into the introductions of our speakers today and then hand over to them. So this is going to be aimed at more of a very informal, casual discussion. Please feel free to engage with Brad and Murray as and when they speak of topics that are of interest to you. They will be taking questions during their presentation, so please feel free to either raise your hand or type your question in the chat box. Seppo and I will then refer your question to Brad or Murray, whoever is speaking. As Murray just suggested, it would be great if you could put your camera on while you ask your question, just so that you can get that face-to-face engagement. The session will be recorded, and a link to the recording as well as any other relevant information will be shared with you after the session, and you are welcome to participate as much as possible. We would really like to have this as interactive as possible. And also for streaming purposes, I do advise that if you are not speaking, maybe put your camera off and keep yourself on mute. It just helps with bandwidth so that you don't get a choppy signal, etc. Moving on to the introductions of our speakers, I'll begin with Brad. So Brad is the Executive Director of Signa Group. And as an Executive Director of Signa Group, Brad is an entrepreneur and strategic leader. He has been involved in BEE since 2003 and currently provides executive oversight into 4 Signa Group businesses that offer BEE solutions in private equity, supply chain, BEE calculator software, and consulting. They are Invequity, B1SA BEE Software Management Solutions, Mantis Networks, and Signa Advisors, respectively. As an innovator with a technologically strong bias, Brad is passionate about solving business challenges in ways that are uniquely innovative, highly impactful, and contribute to corporate and country returns. Brad is a graduate of the University of Southern Queensland in Australia, where he obtained his MBA specializing in finance. And then moving on to Murray, I think, who is a familiar face, but let's introduce him anyway. Murray is the Chief Executive Officer of Signa Group. And as CEO of Signa Group, Murray is an energetic and optimistic leader who believes in South Africa and the potential of its people. He specializes in the implementation of private equity as well as employee ownership and broad-based ownership structures. His impressive track record stems from establishing sustainable and financially feasible ownership structures within multinational organizations, in addition to large private corporations and family-owned businesses. His passion for positively impacting the country extends beyond Signa Group as the thought leader and member of the YPO. His unique ability to engage with stakeholders and communities alike supports organizations in driving their transformation agenda successfully. His enthusiasm and desire to bring about significant transformation in the South African business arena equips him to guide strategies aligned with best practice and sustainable outcomes. He is a graduate of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he received his Bachelor of Commerce degree and diploma in accounting. He has obtained his Chartered Accountancy qualification with the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, SAICA. Thank you very much. I apologize if I fumbled over anything, but I will now hand over to Brad and Murray, and let's have a good discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anika. It's really good to see everyone attending here, and I'm hoping that we're going to have a fun session. It's that time of year where I think we're sort of clawing our way to the end. It's been a very busy year, very interesting year. And so I'm hoping that the next sort of hour or so, we can have a little bit of fun and learn some of the insights that are happening that we're seeing in the marketplace around ownership solutions and enterprise and supply development, and also some innovation that we'd like to share that we're seeing happening in this space. So really happy to be here. Thank you, Anika. Thank you to AmCham for the opportunity to chat with your members. Yeah, and I'm going to dive straight in by just really wanting to touch on the fact that there's such a strong alignment between what AmCham is trying to do and the US companies operating in South Africa with the transformation and BEE agenda. And you know, in your vision statement, you talk about sustainable socioeconomic upliftment, and today I think you'll get a sense that that is a very strong theme for us at Signa, and what we stand for as an organization, and how we see the transformation in BEE codes as supporting that. So what I'd like to do is just, for those of you who don't know much about the Signa Group, I'll just introduce you to a little bit of who we are, and then we'll get into some of the technical understanding of the ownership and ESG elements. And as we go through that, I'm going to encourage you that if you speak about any questions or challenges or thoughts you may have in that regard, that we can do that in an interactive way, because I think that'll create a lot more interest for all of the members here. That you can hear about what your peers are struggling with, or the challenges that you're facing, and some of the solutions you've come up with. And then we'll also talk about some of the best practice that we're seeing in the marketplace right now. So who is Signa? Just to give you a sense. I took our executive management team on a strat session a couple of weeks ago, and when we had someone take a picture, I had a look at it and say, Signa as an organization is really walking the talk when it comes to the transformation agenda. In terms of our diversity, equity, and inclusion, 88% of our employees are Black, 50% of our CEOs and GMs that run our companies are Black people, 54% women, and 40% of our executive committee are women. And I realized, in hindsight, that when we talk to our clients and engage, particularly with our multinational clients, these are some of the big challenges that our multinational clients in particular are measuring themselves against. And so it's very encouraging that, in the South African context, it is possible to operate businesses, successful businesses, where diversity, equity, and inclusion is just part of the framework of your business. So if we were just to summarize how Signa operates in the marketplace, we operate a number of niche operating companies. So that executive team that you see there, that represents the CEOs or GMs of our various operating businesses and their 2 ICs. And they operate in this, let's call it, Ferris wheel of what makes up Signa Group. And today we're really going to just talk about the strategy element, where we engage with clients to help them with their transformation strategy. But I just wanted to mention that in the transformation space, we've developed over the years, and I think, Brad, you've been in the transformation space for probably 20 years, myself for about 15 years. And over that time, we found that what really works for our clients is to have very precise niche solutions for very specific problems in their business. And so it's sort of a generalist, one size fits all, doesn't really deliver the value that our clients look for. And as a result, what's happened is we've created a group that has very specific focus areas. So today, Madelia is with us, and she represents and heads up the Signa Advisors business in Signa Group. Brad and myself operate very much with the private equity. I'm quite heavily involved in Invequity, and Brad is driving the supply chain businesses B1SA and B1 Link. So, and those are obviously relevant to our conversation today around ownership and ESD. But for the rest of the Signa Group, really focused on delivering skill solutions, because that is another priority element on the scorecard. And again, each aspect of the skill solutions, for instance, bursaries, the unemployed, the employed learnership space, they're all very specific. Even the yes programs are very specific, and so Signa's evolved to service those particular requirements in the scorecard. And as we go forward, we'll see that all of these solutions are what we use to serve our clients across, and you'll see some multinational clients appearing there. But one of our core focus areas is really trying to deliver a new way of thinking around transformation, and we're going to share some of that new thinking that we're bringing to our clients with you today. So if we can just, maybe I should scroll so that's okay. So our focus really.
By the way, Mario and I are actually together here. Yeah. So if you see like this above your shoulder, you know it's me.
That's what you got to do when you got a partner like that, eh? So our goal really as an organization is to prepare Africa for a working future, and that means really engaging in sustainable socioeconomic policy and implementation, very similar to what AmCham is hoping to do with its members. And I know, looking at your various companies, sustainable long-term socioeconomic solutions are key elements in your strategy. So let's get straight into some of the technicalities around these priority elements of ownership and ESD. And I'm going to hand over to Brad, who's going to sort of chat to you about how these elements actually, funny enough, talk very closely together. And so the experience for American companies where really, it's a real difficulty to deal with ownership. In our view, it means that you're actually missing an implementation opportunity for your ESD strategy. So I'm going to show a little bit later on how we can link both ownership and ESD as a way of sort of unlocking best practice for your strategy. And I know for most of your organizations, ownership is just not even on the radar. We seem to think that there's an opportunity to bring it on the radar without necessarily going the equity equivalent program, which I know Johnny is experiencing. And I'm sure, Johnny, you're going to share some of your frustrations and experiences about that. But we believe that if you can tie the two strategies together, you can unlock a lot of long-term sustainability and BE benefits. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to hand over to Brad just to open the conversation around some of the more technical aspects.
Thanks, Murray. I think the starting point is, let me just take a step back and just say this for all of our sakes. I mean, you'll notice the wheel of Signa and the type of solutions that we offer just keep proliferating. If you saw that wheel a few years ago, there would have been, only 6 spokes on the wheel. We're going to have to find a different way to present it. But the reality of the circumstances in our mind, and this is particularly true of these two elements, being ESD and ownership, is that these elements have evolved a lot over time. And when we sort of first had the codes come out or come upon us in 2007, really being implemented in 2008, they are complex and people need to get their heads around it, and you sort of find what is the lowest cost of the next point, and the approach was really a compliance approach, and to a large extent I think that's still the case. And it's still a lot of people and a lot of corporates are looking at it, looking at the codes and saying, how do we just get to our level of compliance and our outcome that we need? And the approach is not dissimilar to what you sort of seen represented on the slide in front of you. You take these elements of the scorecard and you say, okay, we're going to spend our ED and our SD and our SED because those are the lowest sort of low cost points that we spend on them. And skills is very, is an expensive element. So we'll sort of spend, what we need to get the sub minimum. And because of the construct of the skills element, we might get a bit more. By the way, the average skills that we're representing there is the average of the members of AmCham in terms of the scores that we've got. So then what we do is we look at preferential procurement and we say we've got to achieve the sub minimum on preferential procurement. We see what we can do in the structural elements. I mean, preferential procurement and employment equity are really the structural ones. So if the first ones are spend, then you've got the structural elements of employment equity and preferential procurement, which take a little bit more to change, a little bit more effort to change the way supply chains work and your demographic of your staff. And by the way, that again, that average is the average across the members of AmCham. And then you really you've spent a lot already. You've done what you can on the structural side, and now you're on the level 8. It's like we haven't even started to really shift the dial in terms of where we need to be on our strategy, and where we need to be on our strategy is driven by different by different pressures, whether it be client pressures or whether it be some government link pressure or license or whatever the case may be, rebates, whatever the case may be in the particular sector. And then we've got to say, okay, now we've got to have real, we've got to really try and shift the dial, and you can use whatever's left to try and shift the dial. And really what we're talking about that's left is either trying to maximize your preferential procurement points, maximize your skills development points, maximize your employment equity, and some of those might be difficult. And so what you're doing is you're balancing up these things to try and get to, if you do maximize them, you can possibly get to a level 4 before you look at ownership, and then you're going to be dropping, to a level 5. We know in different sectors there's nuances, so this is sort of based on the generic sector codes, and there's different nuances in different sectors, and you might use something like YES program to say I can shift myself up 2 levels, and trying to achieve a better outcome through YES program. But the reality is that, you know, with the mix of these balance of elements, you've got your ownership strategy, and you've got to say, well, what can we achieve, and what do we achieve, and how can we achieve our particular, you know, the particular outcome that we need to on the ownership element. And so we sort of represent that in terms of what is available to us once we've done the sort of the minimums or the averages, what is available to us to try and achieve the objective that we need to achieve, and that includes our ownership, you know, our ownership strategy. And then, of course, you have very, very different, I mentioned the different drivers of what drives it. I won't spend too much time on this particular slide, but as I said, you have client pressures which drive it. And I think the client pressures that we face are driven by the same things that drive our pressures in terms of us trying to achieve an outcome. For example, on preferential procurement, we're trying to maximize our preferential procurement score, which means that our supply chain needs to look in a certain way. And just the same, our clients are trying to maximize their preferential procurement score, and so their supply chain looks in a different way. And the construct of the supply chain is such that it really lends itself towards encouraging or having your supply chain meet certain objectives like Black ownership, 51% Black owned or 30% Black women owned. Many of us, notwithstanding the fact that we achieve a reasonable outcome on our scorecard, okay, many of us around this table are still only contributing to 5 points on the procurement scorecard, right? We're not QSEs, we're not EMEs, we're not achieving 51% Black ownership, and we're not achieving 30% Black women ownership. Even, by the way, if we do equity equivalent, even if we do or have approached the ownership scorecard, we're still not achieving, you know, effectively the, you know, 22 points on the scorecard. We're not achieving. And then obviously the way our clients see us and the way they strategically place us is very important as well. So what are the objectives, and how do we approach these objectives when it comes to ownership? And it'll be interesting to hear from you guys in terms of how you've approached it. Some of you are achieving 25 points on the scorecard through equity equivalence, but as I say, it achieves the objective if your pressures are driven by for example, political pressures, you know, licenses, etc., then we achieve the objective. But if your pressures are driven from clients, and clients really wanting you as a big component of their supply chain or their preferential procurement to potentially contribute more to what their achievement is, just like you would expect your suppliers to contribute more to yours, then we have a then it's a different objective that we're trying to meet. So the first objective is just achieving a desired level of compliance. The second one is maximizing our attractiveness. That's our attractiveness to our clients, which means ticking more of the boxes on preferential procurement. The third one is maximizing our competitiveness, which means keeping an eye on our competitive landscape and understanding how we fit into that competitive landscape. And then very importantly, and these are not in a particular order, this is just the collective of all these objectives, is aligning to corporate strategic objectives. So, and by the way, we believe, and in our experience, this is an area where probably most empowerment ownership transactions go wrong, is that because you have this regulated imperative which is placed upon you, we say, okay, what can we do, you know, to tick the boxes, and very often in doing so we forget doing good business, you know, and so we've seen, I always joke with my team over the years, since the turn of the century, since I've been involved in BBEE, even before the codes, preceding the codes, we've seen, and if you remember at the turn of the century, there was all these sort of narrow-based view of you know, ownership only before the broad-based or the balanced scorecard approach to BBEE. And many of the transactions that were concluded at the time, the BBEE transactions that were concluded at the time, were done to tick the box, the proverbial box on empowerment, but weren't done to, you know, to approach business very, very well. Many of the vendor finance deals that were done at the time, and many that have been done subsequently today, you probably saw last week or the week before last, you probably saw RCL having to write off, you know, their empowerment transaction And they're not the only one. There are many that have done, in good faith, done empowerment transactions, and then have just come against either the non-business risks, whether they be market risks or war in Ukraine and Russia, etc., or some of the other risks that have an impact on this, on their strategy, that the consequence of which is effectively a failed strategy. The worst ownership outcomes are those where clients are doing the deal purely for empowerment purposes and haven't walked a journey or really discerned as to whether it's the right outcome for their business. So lots of people, and we'll talk about the different options in a moment and what we see happening, but lots of companies have gone the route of ESOPs, for example, employee share ownership programs. We know that there was the commissioner took a particular view on broad-based ownership schemes and trusts and ESOPs, and then in 2019 we had that sort of clarity statement, and there's been a lot of people that have gone that route, but that route is not necessarily the best route for every company, and very often in the context of a developing economy like South Africa, that route can actually be counterintuitive, because if we're creating, let's call it paper wealth, so the shares in your back pocket are creating wealth, very often our labor force would rather leave potentially and see that wealth as cash in their pocket than what they would stick around for some potential future event. And so that's just one example, and we'll go through a couple of others in a moment. But the point is that from this perspective is that these strategies are often not aligned to their corporate strategic objectives, and Mary's going to talk a little bit more about that, particularly for foreign nationals and where we have, let's call it, broader global imperatives upon us in the global economy. And by the way, that creates an enormous opportunity in the context of a developing economy like South Africa, which we need to take cognizant of. And so, for example, the ESG strategy, and compliance. We know how big it is. ESG is globally. We know how the big trends of tomorrow and what they are, decarbonization or carbon offsetting, and clean energy and the like. And yet we don't necessarily approach these things, or we approach these things in silos, right? There's somebody looking after ESG somewhere for our company. There's somebody looking after enterprise and supplier development. There's a different person that's job it is to go and explore ownership or equity equivalent with the DTI and go through a rather onerous process to try and get that through the door. There's somebody who's looking after skills development, and we have this very much siloed approach to BEE. And one of the things that we really believe is that people need to take a step back or take a step up and have a look at how these things can join each other. How the dots can proverbially be joined in order to drive this strategy forward. So I think,
Brad, if I may,
yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question of the audience, and that is on your point number 3, maximize competitiveness. Keep an eye on the competitive landscape. I know that if we have a look at some of the attendees here today, and maybe you can speak to this, but one of the most competitive industry segments is the ICT industry segment, where you've got IBM, for instance, who's placing themselves as a level 1 company, who've done an equity equivalent program, have 25 points for ownership on their scorecard. And then Johnny's here representing Oracle, which is currently also in the ICT sector and is sitting on a level 2 status. And you can see just how competitive that segment of the market is and how it's driving the implementation of BE strategy. I don't know if anyone, Johnny, I don't know if you want to comment on the extent to which market pressure is driving your strategy.
It isn't market pressure, Murray. It is more, what is the essence of BEE? The essence is to try and impact the majority of South Africans who need help, not 1 or 2 shareholders or just the staff members, because that was my strategy from the beginning. I was told to keep quiet because they were doing ownership. before I joined, they already had a consulting company where they paid millions of rands. I said, okay, I will not work on ownership. I will work on the rest. And when I earned my stripes, to have the rest of the pillars where if we compare ourselves to the top 10 IT companies that were here over a decade ago, we've got the highest marks on every category.
You have?
Yes, do. And then they started listening to me, and I said, why not impact a lot of poor people that need help in skills development under our ownership scheme? So I can take you through that later on, but that was the strategy, and they bought the idea. I presented to the board of Oracle Corporation. They liked the idea, and then they gave me carte blanche to do what I wanted to do.
So that is a typical non-silo approach that you've adopted. You've looked across all of the elements of the scorecard and said, how can we make an impact here using our ownership as an enabler?
Exactly.
So that's exactly the kind of thinking that we're going to be talking about today. So thank you, Johnny. That was shows you ahead of the curve, which is very cool.
Okay.
Okay. So that's just interesting. So that, but I think the other challenge that we see for most of the American companies is that of the Anika shared the guest list of the people attending today. Only 2 companies have had the opportunity or the ability to address ownership, and that just shows that it's actually a very difficult concept to get across the line with your parent companies, and typically it's because the American companies would generally have policies that says we can't have minority. When they talk about minority, they're not referring to African American, but they're talking about small holdings, in other countries. They just don't have policies that enable that. So it makes it very difficult, other than looking at an equity equivalent investment program, which in itself is quite an onerous implementation. So
absolutely correct. I'll give you later on. I'll tell you all about the challenges that I had. But
well, you used to have hair, Johnny, until you started the IP program, isn't it?
Exactly. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that would like to comment at this point, their own challenges or their own success in terms of this? And maybe I can ask this question, not specific of your company or your own entity. And if you don't want to comment, I see some hands will come to you now. But if you don't want to comment about your own corporate, maybe you can just give a comment on what you feel or think in terms of the impact. Johnny mentioned impact. And we talk about, and everything around BEE, we talk about impact and sustainability and job creation. And, we talk about this, trying to affect the people of South Africa. But I would love to understand, and I mentioned, and I said, very often corporates are ticking the boxes. And that is our experience very often. And I certainly understand the construct of constructing this within the construct of sustainability and impact. But my question is this, and that is, in your experience, are we seeing impact? Are we seeing sustainability in ESD and in ownership type solutions? Are we really seeing the needle shifted in South Africa with what I believe, or we believe, the objectives of broad-based Black economic empowerment is all about? Is there someone that...
Yeah, Zanele, would you like to comment?
Good morning, everybody. I think the Global Supplier Diversity Initiatives, which there's conversations around that, are making the BE conversation slightly easier.
Yeah.
The challenge when it comes to ownership, as you've rightly mentioned, is just around the issue of understanding. So globally, the leaders will understand what you're trying to do. The fear for the direct and indirect ownership schemes comes with who's going to be sitting on our board, what if they block certain decisions.
Yeah.
Then when you look at the equity equivalence, which seems to be much more palatable for multinationals, then you throw in the global pandemic, you throw in the war in Ukraine, even if they were intentions and you had moved the needle in terms of really getting buy-in, we've just been thrown 2 years
Yeah,
backwards
that's
in
right.
terms of the conversation. And I think for most companies, it's probably not that they don't want to do it, but the current economic climate just makes it much more challenging for us locally to put forward the business case to say we need to do this.
I hear you, Zanelli, and I think one of the challenges around equity equivalent programs is the valuation methodologies used, which determine the investment contribution. And sometimes that investment contribution seems very high compared to what implementing a more traditional ownership structure might be. So there's quite a big cost differential between EEIP programs necessarily and how, let's call it, local South African companies can implement an ownership structure. So there's quite a big cost differential, and sometimes we see up to 10 times the difference in operating costs of implementing an ownership solution. But yeah, the geopolitics certainly does influence this. But I think an interesting comment, American companies operate all over the world, and South Africa is not unique in having localization requirements. And, you know, if you want to operate an American company in the Middle East or the Far East or whatever, you have a you have a local partner at 51%, you know, and it's de facto. And if you want to do business with there, that's the way it's done. Very much more simplistic implementations. I think the BEE codes have created a wonderfully complex environment for companies like us, Signa, to thrive, because just understanding the BEE codes itself is quite a challenge. But it's not, the South African situation of transformation is not unusual. It exists in many countries around the world. It's just the complexity of implementation and the cost of implementation in South Africa seems to be high relative to other markets.
Any other, anyone else with a comment that would like to make a comment? Anyone that has a view on sort of sustainability and impact? Are we achieving what we would like to achieve? And if we're not, why not? Or if we are, what are you doing right? Any question? Anyone? Too shy. I think.
Sorry to interrupt you, Brad. There is a comment here from Joanna and Chavaleng saying, interesting, Johnny. Would be interesting to hear more on the strategy taken by Oracle and not only focus on ownership.
Thank you for that. And maybe we can come back to Johnny. He said we could potentially come back to him a little later. So I think we can come back to that in a little while. Maybe I can venture an answer to my own question, if I may, and just to maybe plant some thoughts out there. We all understand the socio-economic and political constraints, let's say, or challenges that we face in the context of the South African market. And but I do have a thought that I'd like to share, and love to, if you'd like to comment on it, just get your comments on it. Very often, and let me share it like this in two different ways. The first one with regard to enterprise and supplier development. The beneficiaries of enterprise and supplier development are entities that are, EMEs or QSEs, 51% Black owned. We understand this. In the latest version of the generic codes, as you know, the upgrade on the enterprise and supplier development element that we still expect to see in all of the other elements, we have this continuum post this, or at least the recognition of continuum post growth beyond EME or beyond QSE. I think that personally, I think that's a very positive change that has been brought about, because if we really want to shift the needle, we need to be thinking bigger. One of my concerns, and this is the first one, is that there's this constraint that doesn't allow us to think bigger within the regulations of BEE, and that constraint is around what it means. And we understand growing something, but if we want to grow something and really shift the needle, we need to be thinking, we need to be growing big. So that's the first thing, is what are there's regulatory constraints around really shifting the needle. The second thing is, and I think this is probably equally, if not more important, is that we pigeonhole the opportunity set because or in the current economy. When we pigeonhole the opportunity set, what I mean by that is we say, let's give a good example. Let me just give a very practical example. Very often we look at, if you take, there's certain sectors in this market where the tier one foreign national suppliers, the top tier suppliers are doing more in this economy than what they would be doing in other economies or in developed economies around the world. So, and maybe I can try and think of a very practical example like the OEM sector, the automotive sector, where for example, the manufacturer of, let's just take any commodity that gets added onto a car, like a bumper, right? Where the manufacturer of the bumper in the South African market, the person or the entity, the foreign national that's manufacturing that bumper, is also doing a lot more than just manufacturing the bumper. There's the plastic add-ons and the little things that come with it, and the lugs and the screws and whatever the case is, because those tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers aren't necessarily available in the South African economy. And so in the context of the South African economy, we say, well, this is, you need to do that. What the codes then push you to do from an ESG perspective is to try and say, well, let's create the tier 2s and the tier 3s in the South African economy, because we need, first of all, smaller entities to tick certain boxes on the procurement scorecard, like EMEs and QSEs. And then we also need the black ownership targets on procurement. So let's create them in the South African economy, and then let's rather do it that way. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the reality of our economy is that the proliferation of smaller businesses, and this is me putting it out there for your comments, for your thoughts, but the proliferation of smaller businesses on that basis, first of all, from corporate South Africa perspective, the ability to really procure from the second tier and the third tier, the supply risk and the price is impacted the minute that we do this. And so I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying there are some realities around enterprise and supplier development in its regulated, as its intention, let's call it. And so what happens is that, realistically, can we create that? Or even more generically, if I step outside of the OEM sector, is the solution to job creation in South Africa, and this is my question, is the solution to job creation in South Africa a proliferation of small businesses? Because the general mindset is that the bigger businesses are industrializing more. They're going to probably reduce their labor force sizes, so they're not going to grow bigger. They're going to be more efficient, and they're going to reduce the labor force sizes. And so if we want to create jobs in South Africa, we need to be thinking about small businesses, and we need to be thinking about proliferation of small businesses. But with that comes risk, and risk of supply and possibly risk of price, depending on how it's done and how meaningfully, this gets done. And that's one view, and with that view comes the sort of a secondary view. If we really, if not through the proliferation of smaller businesses, then how do we shift the needle in South Africa? And it's possibly through the growing of big businesses. And if you take all things considered in the context of the South African economy, are we trying to solve a South African problem? And I'm talking about we as foreign nationals operating in South Africa. Are we saying, okay, we have this issue in South Africa, and South Africa is generally a small part of our global reach, and so we need to find a way to solve that issue? Or are we taking the view that we can potentially solve some of the bigger issues if we really took a different approach to the South African problem? If we took a real thinking that says RAND-based solution in South Africa could actually solve a problem for some of our global challenges, as an example, if we did it properly, if we really brought the best technical skills to the local market, and we were really able to grow something really, really big and really substantial, and be able to export it even. So we'd be able to accommodate the local market and solve the problem, but we'd also be able to export it. And so that's really the dichotomy of this thinking, is the one way to do it to solve a problem in the micro, or is there potentially a bigger way that we can do this to tie it into, Mary's going to talk a little bit more about this now, but to tie it into the bigger thinking and to say, hey, we can actually do something here that not only impacts on this economy and on what we're doing here, but that we can actually do so well here that we can effectively export it and take it to the rest of the world. And that's where we talk about, ESG in a broader context. Any, just some thoughts. That was my thoughts. If you do have any comments, please feel free to post them. Or if you have a question, then please feel free to post your questions. Mary, any thoughts from you?
In South Africa, less than 30% of jobs are created in the SME sector. But in the US, it's actually more than 67% of jobs are contained in the SME sector. I think there's a problem with the definition of SME, but it indicates very strongly that in the South African context, large corporates and government are by far the biggest employers. And small and micro businesses really are not creating the jobs that people think. We do have the informal micro sector, which is very buoyant, but it's very fluid, and so a lot of statisticians don't actually measure it. But if we were to compare the SME sector in this country with, say, the SME sector in the US, it's a very weak sector, and not creating the growth and jobs that we all talk about. Politicians talk about, economists talk about, but we're just not at the same level as countries like the USA. So I think your point is a very valid one, Brad, from the perspective is that we should be growing SMEs, the smalls, into mediums, and the mediums into larges if we're going to move the needle. And the opportunity to do that because of the legislation is quite limited because the focus is on small, QSEs and EMEs. So it is a challenge for if we're going to move the needle in job creation and create economic growth, that we really need to build small businesses into large businesses. I don't know if that's you guys have that experience in your supply chains, and specifically whether you, because I've seen company policy, this is crazy, but where you're buying from a QSE, they become a generic, and then you decide that you're not going to buy from them anymore. And I've seen that happen, and to me that's just nuts. But I don't know if anyone has a policy like that in this room.
You guys are going to leave us hanging today, right?
It's a tough crowd today.
Tough crowd today. It's all good.
That's okay.
What we said we would do is we would take you through our experience. We've committed to take you through our experience of what we are seeing happening in the space of ownership and in the space of enterprise and supplier development. And again, if you feel that you need to comment, or if you want to raise your hand, just please feel free. We'd like you to be as interactive as possible. So what we have is basically the different ways that ownership is contemplated from a BEE perspective. And we just want to share with you a little bit of our experience as to how we see this, or how prolific we see this, these different options occurring in the market, in our marketplace. I mean, starting with the first one, direct.
Sorry, just Madile had a question.
Oh, sorry, Madile.
Thank you, Brad. I was happy to let it go. I just wanted to comment because you spoke about legislative constraints, where the companies concentrate on the micro enterprises, and then when they become big, they stop working with them. But I should think the idea really with the codes was that the market will think bigger. There are so many companies that are so small, or they cannot even start. So you concentrate on them, but that doesn't mean that when they become bigger, you leave them. But you don't necessarily have to be rewarded for that. I guess the legislators were just thinking that we understand the idea, so we don't have to legislate for when they are bigger, that, that thinking, understand what you're doing, and then you can support them. So it's frustrating to see that happening in the market. I just wanted to comment on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Madile. And I think what you're saying is very valid. I think what you did right about what the legislator intended. And you would know, you were there when the legislator put it together, I guess. But more than that, I think it is fairly obvious to say, we've got to grow this into a large organization, and then that's ESD helps us to commit to that, and then preferential procurement helps us to remain committed to it, because we have to continue to, for example, procure from companies that are 51% black owned. And so if we really want to change or shift the dial on the preferential procurement side, then we need big suppliers that are 51% black owned. And so the continuum of enterprise and supplier development is a supplier that's actually in your, that's in your supply chain and very big, in your supply chain. So, and I think that is what's intended. Unfortunately, and that's why I say it's very fortunate that the codes were changed, the generic codes were changed the way that they were, because, and I look forward to the other sectors aligning, to that, which we suspect is quite imminent. But because then what it says is that post your commitment to the small entity, you can still enjoy the benefits of that commitment for 5 years, after the enterprise is a larger enterprise. And it would be, and I think so that heads us in the right direction. So thank you for that comment. I'm going to then come back to the options that we've got on, that we've listed here. There's a few slides on these options, and let me start with the let's call it the most obvious one, a direct investment by individuals or black-owned corporates into your business. This is not one that we see prolifically on the foreign multinationals, especially the larger foreign multinationals. We don't see direct, ownership in there. I think the smaller foreign multinationals do look at it more and more. Look at and as I said earlier, the more they're looking at strategic value that can be unlocked, then the more successful the partnership would be. One of the challenges with BEE equity ownership, not now, but originally it was almost like we need to have this outcome, and so it changed what would ordinarily be a journey into an event, and that's rather unfortunate. But over time, if we had in 2007 started when the codes were released, if we had started the journey, we would possibly have been in a different place today if we really started the journey on a conventional business basis. In other words, not saying let's find a way to achieve points on the scorecard for ownership, but let's find a way to really add value to our business in the context of the South African market or sub-Saharan African market or African market even, if indeed South Africa is seen as the conduit into Africa. And if we approach it and started the journey early with saying what would it take to do something different, then we would effectively, then we'd be in a different place. So direct investment does happen. We see it a lot more obviously with local businesses, a lot less with foreign businesses, and obviously it should always be a consideration where we find the right partner to unlock the right type of value. Broad-based schemes, employee schemes, and trusts, just to comment quickly on those ones, they are very popular right across the spectrum, local and foreign multinationals, particularly with ESOP type schemes. There is obviously, I'm excluding those larger foreign multinationals that have these policies that Murray talked about. But other than those, these are very popular. They're very popular for larger entities, larger local entities, even listed entities. They're very, very popular as well. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that they went through a little bit of a challenge with the commissioner's views on what, for example, beneficiaries versus shareholders, etc. But I think the clarity notice in 2019 has provided clarity around those type of things, and they remain a very popular means, and we see them quite prolifically. Optionality is where entities are using sort of call options or some optionality to give or provide economic interest and voting rights to the option holder, which would be a person of color or an enterprise of color. And we've seen them not prolifically, we've seen them being used, we've seen them being taken advantage of to quite a large extent. It is very important. We say the net value is very important because there is a requirement in the codes that net value is created over this optionality, and it's rather a conundrum because net value needs to be created even if the option is not exercised, and that's I think where people take a little bit of advantage, because they say, well, we get the benefit whilst the optionality exists, and if the option's not exercised, who's going to measure it, and we don't no longer get the benefit. But in earnest, the codes require that net value gets created even if the option is not exercised. And so that is being used, and often often taken advantage of. The other thing we've seen, which we don't like, is where options sort of get written for 2 years, and then you have sort of owning the net value for the first 2 years. In other words, 20%, you know, the 20% debt graduation, and then they cancel the optionality and they write new options as it, and that then gives rise to a new transaction date, and the net value graduation starts again. In terms of the substance of that, it would be fine if the net value in the previous option was actually realized to the extent that there was net value. But it just mentioning, you know, that we see that used, maybe be taken advantage of a little. It can be done properly, and we have seen and assisted clients to do it properly where they wish to walk the journey through optionality before they make the actual, before there's an actual, and they want to sort of measure and assess the value before, and the value would determine whether the option is actually struck or not. So we see that. Any comments on that, Manu?
Yeah, options are great because you don't have to issue shares to your black shareholder, and I think this could work for multinational companies. The only problem, and I think it was mentioned by one of the attendees, is that the issue of control. I think Zanelia was talking about that. So what is required in the codes is that the option must be irrevocably held in the hands of the option holder, the black shareholder. And often what I see in option agreements is that the irrevocable nature of the option is undermined by the legal agreements. So whilst it's a good solution, if you can't issue shares, what happens is you measure the option for black ownership purposes. Option itself must be irrevocable in the hands of the option holder. And I think that's where some of the legal fancy footwork can undermine the intention of the codes around that. So whilst we have implemented option schemes for our clients, we've done it in such a way that the irrevocable nature is held in the hands of the black shareholder, and that they are able to exercise that option after walking a journey with their company. And that's obviously a journey where shared value is unlocked. And where shared value is not unlocked, then the black shareholder has the option not to exercise the option. I think that optionality held by the black shareholder is sometimes makes it difficult for companies to implement properly. So a good legal structure, but it needs to be done well.
Thanks, Murray. And so just before I go off the slide, I just wanted to mention that we have seen foreign multinationals that have put trust structures together, trust structures that align to, let's call it global imperatives, potentially around impact, sustainability, maybe even ESG, and that then they use the trust structures for both their potentially for the enterprise and supply development contributions, as well as potentially for ownership impact. And so we have seen those type of solutions in the market as well. The other ones, we've spoken about equity equivalence a little, and I think that is the very commonly used in the context of the foreign multinationals, especially where their policies prevent them from actually having ownership. The challenges, there's, you know, the challenge is that it does end up, as Murray said, being quite expensive. I think the other challenge is that it does take time, Johnny will tell you, to get these things through the door. And I think finally the other thing is that it doesn't solve for it solves for points on the scorecard, but it doesn't really solve for those competitiveness, you know, the 51% black owned procurement as an example. If that's what drives your business, if there is a large sort of competitive nature and we want to be more attractive to our clients, then it doesn't necessarily solve for that. Sale of assets, I'm sure most of you know about sale of assets now. It is an interesting one that is often overlooked because it sits outside of, let's call it the statement 100 ownership, and it sits in its own statement in terms of sale of assets. And the notion of sale of assets, if you don't know, is basically that you sell a part of your business or an asset from your business that's a sustainable asset. You sell it to a black owned entity or person, and that brings you BEE benefits. And we have certainly seen this in assisted entities with meaningful sale of asset transactions where, for example, pharmaceutical company in the local market owns and controls the, let's call it the beneficiation of the pharmaceuticals in the local markets. In other words, the tablets or pills come in mass and they get packaged and distributed, you know, out of a plant in South Africa. And it would have been unconventional in the global market for the entity to have that plant in their, you know, in the traditional sense of their business. And so they sell that plant to black owners that are in this business in South Africa, and then basically procure from that business, you know, the beneficiation of their pharmaceuticals. And that is one example. There's also been examples of foreign multinationals that own the property that they are sitting in, and they would then sell the property to black-owned business and lease it back, and to a black-owned property business and lease it back. And as you know, in terms of sale of asset, the value of the business sold relative to the value of your South African operations is claimable as ownership in your own enterprise. So in that one, you're not giving away anything similar to equity equivalent. You're not giving away any ownership, but you're getting the benefit of black ownership to the extent of the value of the asset or business sold multiplied by the BE credentials of the asset or business sold. And after 3 years, that relative valuation and relative BE credential is basically pinned down, and you continue to enjoy that benefit thereafter. So a really good one, a really good but opportunistic one that a lot of people overlook. And
Yeah,
I think
it doesn't suit many businesses. So
yeah, because they're not asset rich often. Private equity, we've seen more and more private equity, black-owned private equity companies being formed over the last few years. We've seen, in fact, we have a private equity entity that Murray mentioned right at the beginning, in Equity, and we've seen some of the holdings that we have through that private equity fund, which brings black ownership credentials to the underlying entities. We've seen them being purchased or exited to black-owned private equity. So they sort of go from one to the other, and there's been some big ones. In fact, even US companies that we've assisted in the past have been through that. And so that one is quite a unique offering, and it also allows an entity to find a suitable partner that can really help with their broader transformation and impact and growth strategy in the local market. Murray, any comments on any of those?
No, I think what I'd like to do is tie that element of private equity to the ESG discussion. So that, for me, that's going to be quite an interesting one that I think is quite an innovative approach.
All right. I think at this point, I'd like to say, if you do have any comments or questions on the ownership side, you're welcome to to post them or to ask or to put your hand up. Obviously, just that we go without saying that when considering any option for ownership, we also have to look at, again, driven by those strategic factors right at the beginning, we have to look at how do we maximize this outcome in terms of the subgroupings of BE ownership, including black women ownership, designated groups, and new entrants. We often try and separate these three things, the structure in terms of what's the optimal structure to maximize your benefit, and then also the finance components of it. What's the right deal? And I just want to comment on the finance side very quickly, is that very often people, say, well, how do we finance this? Or we've got to finance it like that. And just to tie this back to our original comment around doing good business first. If it's a good deal that's going to add value and unlock value for the organization, then it's likely a deal that can be financed. And we always say just separate the matters, because if you're going in saying, how do we finance this? You might find that it's the wrong deal. If it's the right deal and it's going to bring the right amount of value, then the finance follows. Finance follows a good transaction. Right, and then we're going to move on to ESD, Murray.
Yeah.
You want to?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Murray, before you begin, Fikile is asking if the slides will be shared with the attendees after the session.
Yeah, no problem. We'll PDF them to you, Anika, and then you can distribute.
Fantastic, thank you.
So this is an area where I think the American companies, all of you guys do really well, is in your enterprise and supply development side, specifically talking to enterprise development and supply development. And all I want to do here is touch on some of the popular approaches and then see how these can actually relate to a broader enterprise and supply development plan integrating with your ESG requirements. So what we've seen in the marketplace is right in the beginning of in the BE days, companies would write out checks to beneficiaries and just make grants for enterprise development. And then the codes changed and split enterprise development and supply development. And we started seeing companies doing more interest-free loans. And we all know that we get 70% recognition for an interest-free loan to a beneficiary. And what we've also now started seeing becoming more popular is making minority investments, where companies are engaging in very proactive relationships with their supply chain. So supplier development, when it came into the codes, encouraged large companies, multinationals, to be much more involved in their supply chain. And as a result, allowing for minority ownership in that supply chain made a lot of sense, because if you have to be actively involved with your suppliers, it's quite useful having an equity ownership in that business, a minority equity ownership in that business, especially if it's a critical supplier to you. However, what we find practically is that you're trying to run your own business, and now suddenly you're a shareholder in a business in your supply chain, and that is quite difficult or complicated. And so we see a proliferation of outsourced ESD providers. And to be honest, many of those outsourced ESD providers have not done a great job of driving real, meaningful and sustainable transformation, as Brad was talking about. They end up just being another layer of cost in driving ESD. So these are some of the areas where companies get their BE points for ESD. One that we're seeing now becoming, again, more popular is that organizations are able now to measure the amount of time that employees spend in assisting their suppliers. And so the time of employees productively deployed can be claimed at 60% of the salary cost. And so, if your employees are already doing that, you might as well measure it and then earn your ESD points for it. So we're seeing that as companies become more data-driven, you're able to measure these contributions more effectively. And then obviously direct costs, where you allow your suppliers to potentially operate off your premises, as in that example Brad gave earlier, the pharmaceutical company. If you have a facility with a production facility on it, you sell that facility to your ESD beneficiary, you allow them to operate on your property, you can claim some of those lease costs, as an example. So this is what we're seeing. The one that we think is worth utilizing more because of the ownership element of private equity is minority investments in black-owned EMEs and QSEs. So I'm going to show you how these can also relate to one another. Sorry. So again, how do we get out of the silo approach? Because I think for me, if we can get that right, then we can unlock a lot more long-term value, both certainly in the supply chain and in terms of our ESD our budgets. So I don't want to touch too long on that, other than to say, here's an idea, and it's not an idea. It's a structure that we're implementing with one of our large South African clients, but it's absolutely relevant to foreign multinationals, and particularly American companies that embrace the ESG agenda. This is just to give you an example of a structure that we're implementing to show you what's possible when you look at ownership in ESD in a non-siloed approach. And we all understand the imperative around companies embracing policies and procedures and implementing ESG programs across their businesses. In fact, we see the budgets for ESG way outstripping the budgets that are set aside for BEE purposes. And our view is, well, we'd rather not spend twice. Let's see if we can spend once and get the objectives of both ESG and BEE. So here's just an example of a client that we're working with, and this is what they stated in their ESG report. They said, in terms of environmental, we need to deliver on our environmental strategy. Renewable solar energy and rainwater harvesting was part of their environmental strategy. In their BEE, under their social, their socioeconomic growth, employment creation, upliftment of communities, they talk about how their BEE plans are going to support their supply chain and procurement targets. So now, putting that together is really where a bit of innovation came about. And so what I'm going to illustrate to you is a structure where we've taken both ownership applied through the private equity principles of BEE, as well as ESG, and combined it for their enterprise and supply development strategy. And so to give you an illustration of how it might work for a US company, what we've done is we've said, I've just sort of taken the structure that we're implementing and overlaid it with what might work for a USA company. So we have established a green energy fund. So this is a fund managed by a Black fund manager. And effectively what that implies is that the green energy fund and any investments made by the green energy fund bring about Black ownership to the underlying investments. We then invite the companies to invest. The company that needs to pursue its ESG targets invests in the green energy fund, and that fund then invests in the companies that are going to do their solar installation and maintenance over the next 10 to 20 years. So what the energy fund does is it invests in the engineering, procurement, and construction company, the EPC company, and brings about Black ownership credentials in the EPC company. It does the same for the installers and for the maintenance crews that are going to be maintaining these solar installations for the client. Then at the operating business units that are operating at different locations in South Africa, the EPC company will install the solar plants, you put the panels on the roofs, and put in all the infrastructure, and then enter into a power purchasing agreement with those operating businesses. So basically, the company was going to implement a solar solution so that it could firstly meet its ESG targets and also just mitigate the risk of load shedding. And now, by putting it into a structure like this, we can drive transformation of the supply chain, so bring about Black-owned and Black woman-owned suppliers to the company. They can effectively fund and install the solar plants, and then enter into a long-term purchasing agreement, power purchasing agreement that creates let's call it a closed loop of a return on investment to the Green Energy Fund, which has been invested in by the South African company. So you can see that it creates a beautiful ecosystem of using not only Black ownership driven into the suppliers, but a return profile for the company investing in the Green Energy Fund. So just to go through some of the benefits as an example, and that would be taking the ESD budget, putting it into the Green Energy Fund. Effectively, that allows for the company to claim 15 points on its scorecard for the next 10 years. Now, the implication is that if a company was doing grants, for instance, every year you'd be making a grant. Now you make one investment, which has a long-term benefit. It has a direct savings impact on the cost of your BE points. So that's benefit number one. Number two is that through the investment of the Green Energy Fund into the EPCs, the installers, or the maintenance businesses, you bring about Black ownership in these businesses, and now procuring the energy solutions from these companies, procuring from the installers, procuring maintenance and support for the infrastructure, maintaining it, making sure it's working for the next 10 years. You effectively driving your black ownership, black women ownership procurement targets on your scorecard. How these PPA programs, power purchasing agreements work, typically result in a 4 to 7 year payback on the installation of the solar systems, and so within 7 years tops, you're able to return the capital that's been invested in the fund back to the investors. In this case, it would be the South African Investment Company. Then, as over time, these power purchasing agreements allow for return on investment. So now, not only does your minority investment in the fund meet your ESD requirements, but you're now generating positive returns from your ESD investments. Then some of the good news stories is your SME, you're developing small and medium enterprises. In the maintenance and installation businesses, we say to our client, in our particular example, we've said to our client that they need to also think about using their skills development budget to train artisans and maintenance crews. So they're going to be picking up some of their skills development budget through that. And then also this particular client has used Yes in their business, and now there are destinations for their Yes interns to, particularly if their Yes interns are wanting to have technical qualifications. Importantly, this structure allows for the company to report on meeting their ESG targets, and for US companies, I think this is a particularly important reporting requirement. And then ultimately, carbon credits will be released by structures like this. So companies are able to meet their decarbonization targets, unlock carbon credits, and again, those are another return on investment from the structure like this. So I've just put it out there to give you an example of what's possible when we stop thinking in silos and we start seeing transformation fitting in to a larger ESG agenda. Lastly, point number 10 is our private equity structures do enable ownership to be an option for the local operating companies, and that's obviously something that we can discuss with any of your businesses that are potentially interested in saying, how do we solve for our own black ownership requirements? A structure like this does allow for that as well. So, but here's to just give you an example of some of how looking outside of BEE purely as a silo and looking at how it integrates with an ESG strategy can unlock significant benefits and value for companies operating in South Africa. So I hope that was interesting. I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments around a structure like this, but I think we're going to see more and more innovation around how BEE can support your ESG strategy.
Maybe I can just comment whilst Mary, whilst anybody wishes to comment on it or come back in. And that's the important thing about this type of an approach. Yes, in this particular one, it happens to be, solar implementation aligning with the ESG policy of the entity. The important thing about this is that it always starts with what your corporate objective is. What is your specific? So it could be different for you, and that is in our minds what is going to be the differentiator going forward from the past. The past has been there's been a lot of let's call it supply side solutions that have come to the market. And what I mean by that is we put a program together to take black owned entities through let's call it a management improvement program, as an example. And then we go and sell that program to as many entities as what we can. Now there's nothing wrong with that. That can be beneficial, but very often the entities are not seeing a shift of the needle or anything substantial coming out of that. What the approach going forward, as opposed to supply driven, and supply driven basically says we package up something and then we go sell the package to everybody. And demand driven says what drives you as a corporate? What is your your global ambitions in terms of what you're trying to achieve globally in the larger context. And demand driven says, now how do we join the dots in a de-siloed approach to saying how do we deliver those imperatives in the local economy and at the same time deliver as much of the BEE value as possible. And I think that's the key in my mind to the distinction between the history that hasn't, in my mind, really shifted the needle tremendously, and the future, which says, because if we do this right, you do something here that is even exportable, that is, carbon credits are tradable. There's so much more that can come out of this if it's done right and it's supported by real demand from your business.
Lawrence, you have a question.
Yes. Firstly, compliments on a very innovative structure. I'm from Quivertree Capital. We work in a similar field. And what's so innovative about the structure is that you're turning the initially white-owned SMMEs to companies that qualify for ED/SED via your private equity.
That's quite right.
A question that I have, there's an injunction, you've got to black private equity companies must invest in companies that on aggregate are already 25 black owned. And I'd like to mention how you deal with this, because what's described here is you're investing in white-owned entities.
Yes, so I think the assumption that we're investing in white-owned entities is not entirely correct, because there are black owners operating in these businesses, and they would meet the minimum 25% requirement. But at 25%, you no longer qualify. You don't qualify for ESD, and so it's the fund is there to enhance the ownership to the 51% level.
Very good.
A very good question. Thank you, Lawrence. Cool, but it's nice when your competitors acknowledge a very innovative structure. So I thank you, Lawrence. We're very excited about it as well, and we're excited because there is such a pent-up demand for green energy solutions, particularly green energy funding solutions for companies operating in what I would call the mid-tier space. There's a lot of financing available through financial institutions and DFI, in investment funds, but at the mid-tier level, it makes sense if you can offer a solution that allows companies to self-fund their greening of their businesses, and particularly if it can create a sustainable long-term solution over the next 10 years. We anticipate that this is going to really enable companies operating in the local market to drive the right outcomes, in terms of greening their businesses. Anika, so that's it from our side. We were just we've been through obviously some of the technicalities, some of the trends that we're seeing in the marketplace, and then wanting to sort of show attendees and members that one can think outside of the silo approach and really unlock value. So I'm hoping that that today's session has been thought-provoking, and also give everyone an opportunity to consider how to build an ESD strategy that links in both with ownership and potentially with your ESG requirements going forward. It's been a pleasure to see everyone and to chat about this topic that I think can do a lot better if we apply a more creative approach. So I'm hoping it's been of value to all the members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad and Murray, for your time today. And thank you so much, Madile, for helping us facilitate this. I see we have 6 minutes left, so I'm going to maybe open the floor for just any last minute comments or thoughts. I see Lawrence has said in the chat here, thank you guys, a very useful presentation. May I also ask maybe Brad and Murray that when you share your slides with me, if you can please include your contact information so that should any attendees wish to contact you, they are welcome to. I see Joanna also said, great session, thank you very much. So please feel free, anybody, I'll give you a few minutes if there are any comments or questions you may have, just to end up the session, and then I'll just hand over to Madile as chair.
Yeah, Anika, I think one of the members asked Johnny to share some of his experience around the EIP, if he's available to do that.
Yes, yeah, it was Joanna saying more on the strategy taken by Oracle, not only focus on ownership.
Yeah, look, there's so little time. What I would suggest is in our next forum meeting, I think I get a slot to take it. There's so much to discuss on EIP, and it's so little time left. It's 5 minutes left. So very quickly, what I can suggest is, EIP, why did we choose EIPs? Because, as we said earlier on, is that we impact more people on a broad-based strategy than just a few people on the ownership side. And Murray did mention that other countries do have this. For example, in Saudi Arabia, they have Saudization. You have a little bit like that in Nigeria and Kenya. The big ones are India and Japan. Most of the companies had to sell shares locally. And when you go to the DTIC for exemptions to sell, to participate in EIP, you need to tell them exactly which countries you participated in selling shares locally. If it is a trend to sell shares locally, you cannot participate in EIP. You have to have an exemption that will be passed by them. And the challenges I had, I think we will discuss it in my next forum, but it's taken us 2.5 years to get the permission. And the last challenge that we ever had was everybody okayed it. They said, okay, I know you're going to put in a lot of money, and I will tell you exactly what it is. The biggest amount ever put by any ICT company from international vendor was Microsoft with 750 million over a period of 10 years. Second highest was IBM with 700 million rands over a period of 10 years. And wait for it, we will be putting in 2.7 billion rands over a period of 10 years, educating the primary schools and high schools on Java coding, which is one of the top coding languages in the world, and for database, fundamental databases for both primary schools and high schools, also teaching them robotics in the primary schools as well. So the challenges we had is that they wanted us to even put the IT infrastructure, and that will cost too much of money. So we said we can only put what we said we will put in, and then later on they came back and said we will pass it if you do some investment on SMMEs, because this particular exercise we are doing is over a long period of time to trying to skill our people, and we need immediate skills and to ensure that there's lots of impact with SMMEs and what can you put on SMMEs. So that's what we're working on at this point in time. It was a big sell through to our corporation, which said we are putting about the biggest amount of money. Why do they want us to put in more money? But anyway, to cut a long story short, we are going to put some money with our business partners, and I'll come back to you on what we're going to do. And that's we've got something, an innovative way to help the SMMEs. And if I get a slot in the next forum, I will try and explain to you guys all the challenges we had and also what we're going to do with the SMMEs. Is that okay?
That's a great suggestion. Thanks, Johnny. So we'll reach out to you because we need to still determine the dates for 2023, but we'll definitely put you in for the first slots. It's a great suggestion. We appreciate the sharing of that information and knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more closing comments? Otherwise, I'm happy to hand over to Madile.
Thank you, Anika. I can only definitely echo the sentiments of everybody, and thank you, Marie and Brad. We are indeed grateful for your partnership. Your insights are thoughtful or thought-provoking and innovative. I certainly believe that for impactful and sustainable strategies, BEE needs, or BEE discussion needs to be elevated in corporates. Otherwise, it will remain a tick box exercise. So your session, really, this session has been one of the best sessions this year in terms of content and also attendance. And I believe that our members, since this is our last session anyway, our members will be ready to implement impactful and sustainable biz strategies in 2023. And let me take this opportunity to thank everybody that attended today. Welcome back, Annika, and thank you, Tsepo, for holding the fort for us in 2022. And this being our last session, I really would like to wish everybody a blessed and safe holidays. That's all from me, Annika. Thank you.
Thank you, Madile, and thank you, Murray and Brady. Have a great day and a safe festive season, everybody.
Yeah, thanks very much, and happy Thanksgiving, Paul.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
look forward to seeing some of you at Thanksgiving. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Excellent.
Okay,
Thanks so
then.
much. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
Bye-bye.